Hi, welcome to the Ithihasa channel. So, over the last few episodes, we've been discussing stories that the eternal Gandharva, Angaraparna, was telling the Pandavas and their mother Kunti. So, he started with a story around 7 to 10,000 years ago regarding an ancestor of the Pandavas themselves. Some were Nantapati, who had a son Kuru, from where the Kuru dynasty came. And then when he was asked to talk more about Vasishta and Vishwamitra, he went back to a time more than 15,000 years ago to describe their story. And then, along with that, told a story of an ancestor of Purushottama Rama, a great Ikshvaku king called Kamalashapada. And the stories continue. Om Namah Shivaya, Om Nagendraya Namaha, Om Amme Narayana, Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya, Om Ganeshaya Namaha, Om Anjanaya Namaha, Om Kartikaya Namaha, Swami Sharanamayappo, Om Gurave Namaha. And so, starting more than 15,000 years ago, he told the story of Vishwamitra and Vasishta, and then how they decided to become the Kul Gurus. They both wanted to be the Kul Gurus of the great Ikshvaku dynasty. And it was finally Vasishta who became the Kul Guru of the Ikshvaku dynasty at the time of Kamalashapada, an ancestor of the great Purushottama Rama, a descendant of Raghu. And then on, the great sage Vasishta remained the Kul Guru of the Ikshvaku dynasty. And finally, it was at the time of Purushottama Rama that Vishwamitra then came into the life of Rama himself. And we all know those stories from the Ramayana. And so, in continuation from the time when Vasishta realized that his grandson lived in the womb of Adrishyanti, where we had left off, we come to the point where he took Adrishyanti to his asrama. Adrishyanti, who held the son of Vasishta in her womb for 12 long years after her husband Shaktri died, killed by Kamalashapada. Through those 12 years, she followed a dejected Vasishta who roamed around the northern plains of Bharatvarsha, trying every way to kill himself and in the process failing miserably at it. For he lived having been saved by the forces of nature who treated him as the great Brahma Rishi with the respect that the great Brahma Rishi should be treated, who himself was the immaculate son of Brahma himself. And finally, at a time when he realized she was following him, he asked her who she was. She introduced herself as the wife of Shaktri, who held the child of Shaktri in her womb. And hearing the immaculate verses of the Vedas being chanted in the beautiful voice of his own son Shaktri, Vasishta calmed down his agony, went, peace came over him, and a strange sense of calm came over him, for having known that his progeny is alive and his race will progress, and the Vasishta clan will live on. And so he took his daughter-in-law Adrishyanti to his ashrama and took care of her with all the comforts that were due to a woman of her state. And around that time, it so happened that Kamalashapada came back, tried to attack Vasishta, and Vasishta drew out the Rakshasa in him, for it was time, 12 years had passed. And then Vasishta took his daughter-in-law to the great city of Ayodhya, where he remained the Kul Guru of the Ikshvaku dynasty. And over time, when the conditions became peaceful and the times became good, Adrishyanti gave birth to a child of brilliant tejas as great as his own father Shakti and his grandfather, the great Brahma Rishi Vasishta. And this child was as brilliant as his father and grandfather. From the time of his birth, way before his birth, too, he would recite the Vedas, the six Sangas, and knew all the knowledge of his time, having been given this by his own father in the day. And when this child was born, the great Brahma Rishi Vasishta called him Parasara. Parasara, who could give the gift of life from the gloom of death. This is the same Parasara who at many generations later had a child with Satyavati or Kali on the banks of the Yamuna. A child who would eventually be called Krishna Dvaipayana, for he was dark and born on the banks, on the island on the Yamuna. Krishna Dvaipayana Veda Vyasa would eventually compile the Vedas and so many other Puranas, who would write down the Mahabharata, who would dictate the Mahabharata to Ganesha, who would write it down. That great Parasara was this child of Shakti and Adrishyanti, the grandchild of Vasishta. And so this child Parasara grew up. So if you notice, Parasara was born around the time of Kamalashapada, who was an ancestor of the great Purushottama Rama, who himself existed 12 to 14,000 years ago. And so these rishis had phenomenally long lives. For he existed from 15,000 years ago to 5 to 7,000 years ago to the time of the Mahabharata. And so as Parasara started to grow, he sat at the feet of his grandfather Vasishta, learning everything that Vasishta had to teach. And Vasishta had the knowledge of the universe in his mind. For he was the child of Brahma himself. He knew the secrets of the universe from the time of its inception unto the time that he existed. And his grandson Parasara sat at his grandfather's feet and imbibed every bit of that knowledge. But Parasara did not know that this was his grandfather. He always referred to Vasishta as his father. One day, as he was in conversation with his father, his mother came and sat next to him. And as this boy Parasara would tenderly refer to Vasishta as his father, Adrishyanti broke down in tears, for she knew and she remembered her husband who had died so many years ago. And seeing his mother break down in tears, Parasara turned to his mother and asked her, "Pray tell me, mother, what is it that gives you so much sorrow?" And Adrishyanti, with her hand to her son's cheek, looks tenderly at him and says, "The man you refer to as your father is not your father. He is your father's father. He is your grandfather." And Parasara was shocked, for this was the first time he knew and he realized anything like this. And he turned to his mother and asked him, "Pray tell me, where is my father? What happened to him?" And then Adrishyanti recounted the story of how Shakti had come in contact with Kamalashapada and there was a fight between them, and Shakti had cursed Kamalashapada to be a cannibalistic Rakshasa. And eventually, over time, Kamalashapada came back, attacked Shakti and devoured him, a curse that came to bite him back quite literally. And this brought out a feeling of horror in the heart of Parasara, a feeling of anguish, a feeling of anger that a story like this had been hidden from him, that his father had been devoured by a cannibalistic Rakshasa, and that he was devoid of his father's love. And all these years he thought that Vasishta was his father. He didn't know that his real father had been killed at the hands of a Rakshasa. And in intense anger, Parasara swore that he would commit the entire bhuloka to flames and would destroy all of creation in that anger. And then Parasara sat in a yajna and conducted a yajna of immense proportions to ensure the end of all of creation. And as the flames of the yajna started rising, Not only bhuloka could feel the heat and the scorching flames of the yajna, even asura loka and deva loka could feel the heat of the yajna, and the yajna started progressing with this knowledge of Parasara to consume all of creation. And Vasishta, realizing that his grandson's anger was quite severe, he came to his grandson and told him, "Let me tell you a story, O child. Let me tell you a story of yore. A story that will probably make you understand what this anger could lead to and why you should control it." And then Vasishta started to tell Parashara a story of a time gone by. Instantly, this was a story being told by Angaraparna to the Pandavas and Kunti. And so Vasishta sat next to his grandson Parashara and started to tell him a story of the past. A story of the time of the great king Kritavirya. So the great king Kritavirya was a great king who would conduct great yajnas, a favorite of the gods, a favorite of the rishis, a favorite of the brahmanas around him. He had conducted the great Soma Yajna, a yajna of unimaginable proportions. And in the course of this yajna, he had distributed unquantifiable amounts of land, grains, wealth, silks, jewels, diamonds to all the rishis of the land. He had made the Bhrigu rishis of the land immensely rich through all the money he had donated. Wealth and riches he had donated. Instantly, Kritavirya was also the father of Kartivirya Arjuna. And if you remember the story of Parashurama, of how Kartivirya Arjuna's descendants attacked Parashurama in his asrama. So this was a prelude to that story, and it was a story of Kritavirya. And so at the time of Kritavirya had donated huge amounts of wealth and riches to all the rishis of the land. And eventually, when Kritavirya passed on, his son Kartivirya Arjuna came and took over the kingdom. And we know the story about how Kartivirya Arjuna's children, the evil sons who had not done a great deed in their life, would harass the Bhrigu clan. And so in the story that Angaraparna tells, that Vasishta told Parashara, once Kritavirya had died and passed on,